Welcome to Slick Ride's Garage. On this episode of Slick Ride's Garage, the 1988 GMC 1-ton is back for instrument cluster repairs. With the temperature and oil pressure gauges pegged beyond maximum and several light bulbs working intermittently, I removed the instrument cluster from the truck for a closer look. The first thing I noticed was this rusty screw and a liquid trail running down into the cluster. A further check of the printed circuit and connections on the back revealed several condition issues. All of the copper contacts and gauge connectors are severely tarnished, black, or dull in appearance. One gauge connector has rust in it. A good reason for these issues comes to light when I find the remnants of a once tasty beverage between the printed circuit and chassis. It's very clear. This cluster needs help, so today I'm restoring it to original function and appearance. First, I'll remove the clear lens from the instrument cluster. I'm turning the cap screw slowly and being especially careful when removing the rusty one. Once they're loose, I'll lift the screws off with the lens, collect the screws, and set them aside. The shift position indicator and gauge cover is next. Once the cable is freed from the guide on the cluster's chassis and both screws are removed, the shift indicator and gauge cover lift right off. The speedometer is next. Once the center screw is removed, it lifts right out of the chassis. The item with the 3 wires and green box is an old-school optical vehicle speed sensor and must be handled with care. With a bit of maneuvering, the control box slides right through the chassis. I'm setting the speedometer in a safe place where it won't be damaged. The same bolt also holds in the fuel gauge, which is now easily removed by lifting it gently out of the gauge connectors. Now I'll remove the indicator light covers. These are keyed and can only be installed in one place and direction. They are easily scratched, so I'll set them in a safe place away from the work area. After removing the screws from the remaining gauges, I'll lift them out and set them in a safe place. Removing the printed circuit on the back starts with removing the light bulbs. They're a piece of cake, but the gauge connectors can be tricky. I'm using a pair of 2-position gas pliers on their wide setting to squeeze the base of the gauge connector and rock it in one direction until it pops out of the chassis. The key to success is patience. Once the gauge connectors are removed, the printed circuit comes right off. I'll separate the light bulbs from their sockets, then submerge the bulbs, gauge connectors, and sockets in purple power cleaner. Cleanup and restoration of the gauges starts by lightly wire brushing the contact studs, being careful not to bend or side load the studs. That can damage the gauge. Other than being dusty, these gauge faces are in really good condition. I'm cleaning the gauge faces with a gentle touch and no cleaner. I learned this the hard way 27 years ago when I sprayed one with cleaner and the silkscreen printing came right off. I'm using a gentle, delicate touch when wiping on or near the printing with a blue shop towel lightly moistened with water. I'll wipe the face down as needed, then wipe it again with another clean, moist blue shop towel. After gently wiping the indicator needles from center to point, I'll wipe the faces down one final time with a dry blue shop towel. Now with the faces clean and looking like new, fingerprints and dust are my arch enemies. I'm handling the gauges by the outside edge, putting them in a safe place away from the work area and covering them to keep them clean. As you can see, the clear lens isn't so clear anymore. There are lots of scratches and scuffs to be removed from 27 years of service. After a wash in soap and water, I'll use California Customs purple metal polish straight out of the bottle, applying a generous amount directly on the lens. With a moist kitchen sponge and moderate pressure, I'll spread the polish and buff it in using circular strokes until I feel the lens smooth out. Now, I'll wipe it twice with a clean blue shop towel each time to remove the polish. After just one application, 75% of the scratches have been polished out. Next, using a little less polish and pressure, I'll do the same procedure with the purple metal polish a second time. Now I'll switch to a medium grade compound and repeat the same process twice, reducing pressure with each step. I'll use a little more compound the first time and a little less the second. Lastly, I'll use a fine grade compound and repeat the same process, using less polish and pressure on the lens with each step. The last step is a third application of fine compound to the entire lens. After a light final polishing, I'll wipe it off very, very lightly and just enough to remove the majority of the compound. Finally, I'll wash it again in soap and water with a blue shop towel and perform a final inspection. After a couple of hours and 7 steps, this lens is nearly crystal clear. With the exception of some deep scuffs left by the outer bezel, it looks like new. As a general rule, any scratch in a clear lens that does not catch one's fingernail can be polished out with this process. Deeper scratches cannot be resolved with polishing only, but can often be concealed enough to make it worth the effort. Now I'll inspect the printed circuit, and it's not looking so good. The contacts are corroded and some have delaminated from the celluloid carrier and are wrinkled up. These issues can be resolved with some work and patience, but these broken circuits right off the plug are a death nail. Even after soaking overnight in purple power, the gauge connectors are still discolored. The dealer tells me the gauge connectors are not available and there are 5 of these printed circuits left in the country. I called some local salvage yards and found nothing. There's only one more place to check, so with part number in hand, I'm off to the local self-service salvage yard. After a trip to Buddy's U-Pool in Brookline, Missouri, I found a complete, intact instrument cluster from a 1988 Suburban for $26. After disassembly, I found the printed circuit in excellent shape, so I'll finish strong by using a fine scuff pad to lightly clean each of the connection points. After rinsing and drying the light bulbs and sockets, I'll use a wire brush on the gauge connectors to clean all 3 contact points, 2 at the printed circuit and 1 at the gauge stud. I'm improving the connection at the printed circuit by slightly bending the tabs on the gauge connectors down for more contact pressure. With the chassis now cleaned, I'll lay the printed circuit over it and snap in the gauge connectors. Once properly placed, they snap right in. Next, I'll reinstall the gauges. I'm pushing them into the gauge connectors gently and tightening the cap screws just past snug. The plastic is old and too much torque can strip the threads. I'll lightly wipe the indicator light covers with a moist blue shop towel, then install them. Now the fuel gauge and speedometer can go in. They are initially held in place by this common center screw. The 4 perimeter screws are installed through the clear lens on final reassembly. Installing the gauge cover is next. The blue color on the back is reflected onto the gauge when the instrument panel lights are lit. After a good cleaning, I'll set it in place, then install the shift position indicator. Once the cable is in the guide slot on the chassis, I'll cover it with a piece of masking tape to keep the cable from falling back out. Now I can install the clear lens. After lining up the guide pins, I'll set it in place. Install the 4 screws around the speedometer and fuel gauge, followed by the 2 remaining screws on the left side. I'll top it off by installing the reset knob for the trip odometer. The light bulbs and sockets are last. I'm improving the connection at the bulb socket by slightly bending all 4 of the bulb contacts inwards with my pick on each of the sockets. Watch how the bulb snaps securely into the socket. With the bulb in, I'll lightly bend the side contacts up a bit to improve their connection to the printed circuit. Now, I'll test for continuity with my voltmeter at the printed circuit contact points. If continuity is present, the bulb and connections are good. Mine all checked okay, so I'll install them into the instrument cluster. With reassembly now complete, let's take a look at what I started with. And now, here's a look at the final product. Before I install the instrument cluster back into the truck, I'll finish strong by cleaning all the contacts on the truck's instrument cluster connector.